So I'm Andy Hira. I'm the director of the Clean Energy Research Group and professor of political science at SFU. We started the Clean Energy Research Group about 5 years ago. It was a small group of us who decided that we needed to do more to try to sway public opinion around climate change, and we needed to do more to connect the research that's happening in academics, especially the technical solutions, with practitioners and policymakers. Translate that technical information into information that will be potentially persuasive to policymakers. Now, we know that there are a lot of vested interests that we're going to talk about momentarily in fossil fuels, but we still believe that getting the facts out there and doing a sound, neutral analysis is very valuable. And the topic we're going to talk about tonight really reinforces that point. The whole purpose of this exercise is 5 years of frustration on my part with seeing that there are essentially two different conversations going on at the same time, and they should be connected. One conversation is about climate change, and everyone recognizes the importance of climate change, but they say the more important actual issue is economic crisis. And with the US tariff war happening in Canada and inflation happening, the main tone that you get in the media is, well, we need to double down on fossil fuels, even though it's inconvenient, because it's good for the economy. We need it for jobs. We need it for revenues. And as you know, the current federal government, as well as the BC government, have recently announced projects of national interest, where they're going to make public investments into oil and gas pipelines and LNG ports. And anyone that knows anything about climate change knows that this is a disastrous decision. But it shows you that the politics are not aligned with what we know about climate change. And so the effort that we're making tonight is to bring those two conversations together. That is, good policy around climate change is actually good for economics. It's good for the business bottom line. And that's the point we're going to try to reinforce tonight, and also in the scorecard that is available for you on the CERG website. So my co-presenter is Stefan Pauer, and hopefully my other co-presenter, Esther Nguyen, will be joining us soon. She is a student in the Faculty of Health Sciences. Stefan is an adjunct professor at SFU Political Science and also works for the Clean Energy Canada think tank. And then our other presenter, Martin Hislop, he is the Director, President,
Energy Journalist, CEO of Energi Media.
CEO of Energi Media, one of the largest and most visited sites in Canada around energy news. So if you get a chance, when you get a chance, check out the Energi Media website. You're going to see an abundance of really important, up-to-date information, including interviews with key stakeholders, policymakers, and companies. And so that's a very good website, and that's why we decided to cooperate on this. So I'm going to start by going through a very brief kind of overview of the scorecard. And then if you guys want to dig into the details, I'm happy to do that. I spoke to the Globe and Mail earlier this week. I spoke to them I sent out a press release. It was a couple pages long, and they wrote an article about these LNG ports. And about 90% of the article was about all the economic benefits of LNG. And then they have one dissenting quote, which is my quote at the end. So that kind of shows you how the media is covering these issues. And hopefully with this effort, we'll get some more attention to the scorecard and to these issues.
And you should point out, not all of the media.
Not all the media. The mainstream media, let's say. Okay.
Corporate media. Going down to New York.
Okay, so the title of the presentation and discussion tonight is the trouble with public investment in pipelines. And really the more general question is, to what extent should the Canadian government continue to invest in fossil fuels? We have indirect subsidies for fossil fuels. We have built-in capital through pipelines and infrastructure. And more importantly, we have a pipeline that the Trudeau government decided to buy. And the fact that a government is buying a pipeline should tell you something about the economics of fossil fuels. That is, that the private sector doesn't see this risk as worth taking. So the public sector is stepping in to save this eventually declining industry. And the same thing is happening with LNG. You'll see on the CERG website, we have a paper about LNG, and we discuss all the direct and indirect subsidies that the BC government gave to multinational companies like PetroChina, that China we're supposedly in a trade war with, and Petronas, a Malaysian company, all overseas multinational companies that we're subsidizing so that they can make a profit on LNG. And that, in a nutshell, reflects the fact that the Canadian government and the Canadian public are unwilling to really acknowledge the long-term costs of climate change. Even though we see it all around us, we see it outside in the air tonight, we see it with half of Manitoba burning, and we're going to see those costs increasing over time. So there really has to be a public reckoning with these accumulating costs of climate change. And so this slide in a nutshell kind of summarizes the dilemma that we face. That is, according to recent polls, 69% of Canadians are worried about climate change impacts in the next 5 years, 76% about future generations, 77% say they want the government to prioritize renewable energy. However, 66% had decided that the carbon tax was too costly. And this is an epitome of government misinformation and incompetency. Because remember that carbon tax was never a tax, it was a rebate. So you would pay at the pump and then you would get that money rebated back in your taxes, or it was generally progressive so that lower income households in particular received income support. It was never a tax, but the tax, which was viewed by economists as the most efficient way to actually set the real price of carbon, it was rolled over by both the BC federal government after the last election. And so the top policy priorities are cost of living and inflation, healthcare, housing, and then climate change is fourth. And the case we're going to make to you tonight is you can't separate out economic costs from the rising costs of climate change. In fact, 61% say that they favor expanding natural gas, 51% crude oil. We don't produce a lot of coal. There's not a lot of support for that. And 88% say that oil and gas are important to Canada's economy. So this is the essence of the misinformation that we face. I'm going to turn it over to Stefan now to talk to the real costs and benefits of climate change.
Is there a mic anywhere or just?
I think just speak loud.
Okay, I'll try to project. So in terms of GDP, I contrasted here basically the oil and gas sector versus the clean energy sector. And in terms of GDP, the oil and gas industry contributes around $280 billion every year. And the industry employs around 700,000 Canadians people across the country. If you look at Canada's greenhouse gas inventory, so the accounting that shows you where our emissions come from, you'll see that the sector generated around a third of Canada's carbon pollution in 2023. That's the latest year available. And the transportation sector added another 23%, mostly from using gasoline and diesel in vehicles. The Canadian Climate Institute estimates that unless Canada acts, climate damages in Canada will lead to GDP losses of at least $380 billion per year in 2050. And job losses in all sectors of the economy would be around 350 to 480,000. And the damages escalate further if you look towards the end of the century. Also, according to the Canadian Climate Institute, climate change poses a macroeconomic risk that threatens to significantly undermine Canadian prosperity. And it's visible in those numbers. At least some of these losses could be eliminated if Canada advanced its energy transition. And in fact, another study from Clean Energy Canada projects that Canada's energy sector as a whole would see a net GDP gain by $250 billion by mid-century in a net zero future. So in terms of jobs, there would be 700,000 more energy jobs, and that means for the energy sector as a whole, meaning fossil fuel jobs and clean energy jobs. So basically, it means that gains in clean energy sector jobs outpace the decline in the fossil fuel sector. And that's in a future in which countries achieve their stated climate goals of net zero. Do we have Esther online? So we can turn it over.
Esther, are you online? I don't think so. I'll go through her slides.
Okay.
But there are a couple other points that I want to reinforce that Stefan made. The first is that there's a lot of misunderstanding about the source of emissions, right? The direct emissions from oil and gas are 30%, and transport, obviously, that is from using gasoline, another 23%. So that's 53%. But what I've recognized from talking to the media over the last couple of weeks is people don't understand that the emissions in the other sectors are still ultimately coming almost wholly from fossil fuels. So buildings, natural gas for heat, right? We're talking about agriculture, so tractors that have to be run, fertilizers that are based on fossil fuels. So ultimately, all of these emissions are coming from oil and gas. It's not really appropriate to simply separate out oil and gas. Now, for us, electricity is a really beneficial situation because we have so much hydropower in BC, but Ontario and Alberta are still using fossil fuels to generate electricity. So when we look at these sectoral emissions, we really have to recognize that ultimately it's still coming back to oil and gas. And then the second thing that I think is worth reinforcing is this projected net gain. So that's after you account for the losses in fossil fuel jobs if we start to shut down that sector. And more importantly, those jobs are part of a global competition. And we know from the history of innovation, the first to market is generally the one that gets the job. If you think about the big three automakers that dominated the auto industry, they were the first ones to produce commercially mass-produced automobiles. Think about Microsoft, the fact that we're all using its operating system, or Apple, that first to market leads to oligopoly and monopoly gains. And what Canada is doing by investing in fossil fuels, a sector that the IEA says will decline precipitously in the 2030s, we're investing in the industry of the last century. And we're losing the opportunity to enter into the industries of the next century. And so it's a double set of damage. That is, it's not only the cost from climate change, but it's the lost opportunity of not putting public investment into clean energy and all the jobs that it could potentially create.
Andy, can I clarify one point?
Sure.
That figure of employment in oil and gas is 690, that's incorrect.
Stefan?
I mean, it's from Statistics Canada,
No,
but
it's not. What you're doing here is you're looking at direct, indirect, and induced jobs. That is not direct jobs. Direct jobs.
yeah, it's not direct, that's true. I think it doesn't include induced, but indirect.
No, it does include induced. I've seen the modeling. That's all of it together. Direct employment now is only 180,000.
Yeah, that's a really important correction. And
another number, if you print out the paper that comes with this presentation, there are actually two numbers here. One from Stats Canada estimate, which is 697K, and then there's 2.3 million. That is an estimate by CEC. 2.3 million.
The 2.3 million is not even in the ballpark.
Yeah, this is from a study that we did, and that was a different methodology, and in that report, it casts a net really wide on what constitutes a fossil fuel job. It includes, we did the same thing for the clean energy sector, and yeah, it's a different. You cannot compare those numbers directly.
Gotcha. Okay, so
the important point is that the sources of official information tend to be biased. They're counting jobs that are indirect to fossil fuels industry. And so it's really exaggerating the importance of the sector and the number of jobs that are going to be lost. In a political sense, it's really important because most of those jobs are focused in Alberta. And so there's a geographic focus, and that's why there's so much political pressure. Scott, something else?
Yeah, just a question on clarification on this, because what we see is the net zero scenario has a positive net 250 billion per year, right? and then a net zero scenario of positive 700,000 jobs. In a do nothing scenario, it looks like we would be in a negative situation if we continued as is with oil and gas and on the GDP side, and slightly positive on the job side. Is that a correct reading?
So the do nothing is not on the slide.
Right.
What we have here is we see what is happening today, the contribution. And then if we were on a net zero trajectory, we see there's a net gain both in GDP and jobs. You're asking basically what happened if there's a current policy scenario, how would that compare? Yeah, we have that in a report from Clean Energy Canada. And we actually have 3 scenarios. There's another one with a rollback. And part of that actually happened now because some policy rollback happened where a lot of the carbon pollution pricing got repealed. And that actually leads to, it doesn't lead to more energy jobs actually than in a current policy scenario. So, but it's difficult to compare these across scenarios. The main point is that some of the damages could be shaved off. And I think I want to let the audience draw their own conclusions about contrasting the top part with the bottom part.
So there are 2 other really important points that your question brings up. One is what will happen to the oil market in the next 10 years. And as my students here know from discussion earlier, IEA, EIA, most credible sources project that there's going to be continuing oil supply glut. In fact, the US is pumping that stuff out as fast as it can, just like it's pumping out LNG. And so think about the fact that the EU and China and supposedly Canada, unless we roll it back, and California all have EV mandates that kick in around 2030, 2035. That is going to really shrink demand. So it's no mistake that Saudi Arabia, UAE, Russia, they're all pumping out that oil as fast as they can while the market is still alive. And our tar sands oil is way more expensive and we're farther away than these other markets. So it's a bad bet. And you'll see on the CERG's website, we have done the economic analysis for LNG and we're just not competitive, right? If you ship LNG by pipeline, it's 1/3 to 1/2 cheaper than if you natural gas by pipeline than if you use LNG. And so why would China buy natural gas, LNG, when it can get natural gas directly by pipeline from Russia or Malaysia or Myanmar or any number of other, Kazakhstan, any other number of other countries that are going to be so much cheaper than Canada? In fact, if you look at the statistics, China's LNG demand went down 20% just over the last year. So we're making bets on the markets that are most likely to decline. I don't think Esther, our partner, is here, but there's another important part of our study, which is about health. And that is this: just because fossil fuels aren't visible usually, except for today, we don't recognize the damage that this has had. You see it especially in areas that are close to refineries or close to oil and gas facilities. They call them cancer alleys, like in Louisiana. And they're increasing evidence that proximity to these facilities leads directly to higher incidence of disease. But those higher incidence of disease, they occur across the economy. That is, the more we're exposed to fossil fuels, the more health issues we're going to have. It affects your respiratory system, it affects your cardiovascular system, and it can affect pregnancies. So who knows what untold toll of damage exposure to fossil fuels has had on our society over the last 100 years. And we all know that fossil fuel facilities tend to be set up in lower income areas, more marginalized areas. So there's also an equity issue beyond the equity issue of North and South, which is that countries in the South are paying the price for all of our emissions. So she has found some estimates that the healthcare costs can be estimated at $2,500 to $3,200 per household. And she started to create some categories and recognize that the more that climate change continues, the more that these costs will continue to climb. And when you download the scorecard, you'll see all the sources that she used for these estimates. Stefan, you want to do this last slide or?
Sure. Yeah, so all of these estimates are dependent, or like basically the estimates of the damages that climate change has on well, life, basically, not only the economy, but also health costs, everything is based on an estimate of what is the global damage of 1 ton of greenhouse gas. And those estimates keep being refined over time, and they are being, as climate change progresses, the damages increase. And so these damages are like their estimates for 2030, and then in 2050 it's going to be a lot more. And Environment Climate Change Canada estimates that for every dollar invested in adaptation, $15 could be saved in the long run. So adaptation is basically trying to adapt to live with wild floodings, all these natural disasters, and basically invest in making buildings more resistant and spending more on healthcare, all these things. What else do we see here?
So when we say the social cost of carbon, we're including the actual cost to society of pollution. The cost, this is not the cost to the polluter doesn't bear this cost, but when that pollution is created and all the effects of climate change are counted in, it's costing us $294 per ton with an increasing amount because of the increasing damage and deterioration of infrastructure, healthcare, agriculture, food security. Just think about the mountain pine beetle and how it's devastated our forestry sector. All of those increases in costs, then if you just think about that logically, there's no way that fossil fuels make any sense as an investment. It's revenue negative. And there's one estimate, I don't know what the actual number is, but there's one estimate from a group of economists that how much would it actually cost for us to transform a lot of our energy infrastructure. And they estimate about 128 billion over a decade. You look at 1 year of federal expenditures, it's more than it would actually cost us, assuming that estimate is correct. So it's not going to cost that much. But the question then is, why isn't the government making these investments? Both in terms of reducing the damage of climate change and opening up the opportunity for us to create clean energy jobs. And the answer always comes back to politics. I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Mark. I'll just pull up your slides now.
As I was telling Scott, I'm old and fat, so I'm going to sit down and talk instead of standing. My name is Markham Hislop. I'm the energy journalist and CEO of Energy Media. We've been around for 17 years. And kind of journalism that we do doesn't get practiced here in Canada. You see it in the US a little bit. You see it in Europe, but you don't see it in Canada. We spend half of our time on the international. So we interview international experts like Michael Liebrick and Bond. Lots of superstars. We spend a lot of time in data and evidence. In fact, my hobby is reading oil and gas demand modeling. So when Stefan was talking about, or Andy was talking about the various studies, I read those studies. I'll tell you, I guarantee you that there's nobody in the provincial governments and federal governments reading those studies. That's a major problem. All of this work is being done at the international level. The IEA is the best modeler and data collector in the world. And the Alberta government spends more time calling them political activists and trying to destroy their political currency here in Canada. So that's the kind of conversation we have. So I want to set out an argument for you tonight. I'm going to argue that there are three basic worldviews in Canada around the energy, around the pipeline debate. There's the bulls, the bears, and the in-betweeners. The bulls are obvious. They're Premier Danielle Smith, the oil and gas CEOs, on and on. The bears are not so obvious. And the reason they're not so obvious is because you never see them in the media. Andy just gave you the point, told you the story. The media story, the news story had 90% pro stuff and Andy at the bottom. And that's generally the way it gets reported. We don't do that. We stick to evidence, data, and I'm fond of saying, and by the way, Energy Media, our website, is not as valuable because in January, we switched to video-only journalism. So if you go to YouTube, you'll find we do 3 or 4 videos a day. And so it's video-only. Energy Media is our channel. So the bears are not obvious because nobody ever talks to them, nobody gives them a forum. And the bulls absolutely dominate. I can give you dozens and dozens of names. There's on social media, Brett Wilson, and on and on and on. The narrative machine that the Canadian oil and gas has been around for a long time. It's incredibly well funded in the tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars. And the beauty of it is they think they're victims. They still get to claim a victim narrative and mentality, despite the fact that they dominate and outspend everybody. I mean, you couldn't set this up any better if you tried. And now, with all deference to my buddy Roy here, who likes Mark Carney, I like Mark Carney. How can you not like a guy with a PhD in economics, right? But did we get the values, Mark Carney? Did we get climate finance, Mark Carney, or did we get Goldman Sachs, Mark Carney? That's the question. And it's looking more and more like we're getting the Goldman Sachs Mark Carney. And that's a problem. There's another bull. Tim Hodgson is Minister of Natural Resources, or Minister of Energy. Goldman Sachs, former Goldman Sachs CEO. So Don Farrell, who just got chosen to head up the major projects office. Former CEO of TransAlta, former CEO of Trans Mountain, the pipeline. You can see where I'm going with this. The bulls dominate in Canada. There are no bear voices. There are a few of us. I'm an in-betweener leaning heavily towards the bears. Because if you read enough modeling, if you look at S&P Global, they will argue that oil is sticky. That you have this ginormous infrastructure, it doesn't go away overnight. And there's some truth to that. So you have to acknowledge that as much as you would like to be a bear, be entirely on the clean energy side, there are arguments on the other side, and in its modeling, we can't know how it's going to turn out until we get there. Okay, Annie? Okay, first of all, the OPEC versus IEA. Danielle Smith will tell you, as she's told me in press conferences, she'll say, no credible forecaster says that oil is going to peak in 2030. Bullshit. With a very short, because I read all this stuff, I found 3 that agree with her, which is one of them is OPEC, ExxonMobil, US Energy Information, and 13 that agreed that oil and gas is going to peak in 2030. Lots of them. Bloomberg NEF, Rystad. There's just tons of them, and there's more than that. But here's OPEC, and this is their oil demand. So Andy's, raised the question, why, with all of these climate damages and all the other issues, including electrification of the global energy system driven by China, why do we think that oil is such a good investment? Because everybody believes in the OPEC model. But here's the thing. I've read the model and the assumptions. It's too bad. Chris Bataille is anybody know Chris Bataille here? Energy economist? Yeah, probably you guys do. I've interviewed him many times and he always told me, I'm not a math guy, he said it's not the math of the modeling, it's the assumptions behind the model. And so as a non-math guy, I look at the assumptions. OPEC's assumptions about about the way the world is going to unfold between now and 2050 are riddled with errors, riddled with faulty assumptions. Things like, clean energy technologies like solar and wind and batteries and EVs and heat pumps and so on will stay expensive and nobody wants to subsidize them. So the global south is not going to adopt them at scale. In 2 years since that study appeared, that's been shown to be false. And it's only accelerating. So where are we with OPEC? 102, 103 million barrels a day of demand today, 120 by 2050. So if you're Danielle Smith, or if you're the oil CEOs, or if you're Mark Carney, who sits in Calgary boardrooms with oil CEOs, this is the narrative you get. And it's all driven by narrative. OPEC and the Saudis pump out press releases, they go to conferences, they lobby governments, and it's the narrative. This entire idea that there is going to be growing demand for oil out to 2050 is all driven by narrative. No one can point to a piece of modeling and say, I read that modeling, here are the assumptions, I agree with, this is why this is going to happen. Ethan Melguy, Secretary General of OPEC, was in Kananaskis at the Global Energy Show. And he said in his speech, the best way to understand the energy future and the future of oil is to look to the energy past. Baloney. Because oil, up to now, has never had a competitor. It has one now in the form of electric transportation. And transportation is 45% of global oil demand. Cut into transportation, and that's why the IEA says peak oil demand in 2029. It's not 2030 anymore, by the way, because they're going so fast they have to bring it forward. But this is the narrative. And when you ask anybody who has that narrative, give me the evidence, give me the modeling, explain it to me. They can't. Brett Wilson, I've been fighting with him on Twitter for 10 years, and he can't even come up with one piece of evidence. And he's a thought leader in Alberta. The thought leaders are thoughtless. They simply regurgitate the narrative over and over and over again. And now Carney's picked it up, and now Tim Hodgins has picked it up. Dave Eby, for crying out loud, is picking it up on the LNG side. It's all narrative, no evidence, no data, and no model. Okay, the next one.
I just want to add one thing too. I don't know if you guys know about Lucid. It's an emerging electric vehicle company that was spun off of Tesla. The leading investor in Lucid is the Saudi government. The Saudi government is investing heavily in solar. UAE is trying to become a transportation hub. The oil producers recognize what's happening. Norway is the leader in electric vehicle adoption. Canada is the only one that doesn't recognize that the writing is on the wall.
I wish I could talk to you about the Saudis' Vision 2030, but we haven't got enough time. So this is the IEA model, and this came out of their oil market report in May or June. And the bars you want to look at are on the right-hand side. 2025 to 2030, the supply of oil is going to go up. Look at the bar for demand. There is none. There's literally no growth. So essentially, oil is flat. And if we could get to the next one, yeah. Because here's where it really gets interesting. So the IEA has three scenarios: steps, APS, and net zero. The steps is very much like OPEC, right? A little less, 97. It's kind of business as usual. Nothing changes. Everything's demand stays the same. Nobody that I talk to, no economist that I interview, believes steps is going to be the ultimate scenario. Not a chance. China is driving electrification of transportation, and that's going to drive decline in peak oil demand in 2029. And I hate to say this, Danny, nobody believes net zero. We're not getting to net zero by 2050. Very unlikely. So that number is suspect, which leaves us in between with the announced policy scenario. Kind of why I'm an in-betweener. But look at the decline. 55 million barrels a day in 2050, down from 103. If you built a pipeline and you finished it in 2030, who would you sell the oil to? Okay, and here's an example of the narrative machine at work. Energy superpower. Anybody want to take a crack at defining an energy superpower? There is actually a definition for it. Okay. An energy superpower is a country that can move markets. So Saudi Arabia, through OPEC, can move a market, move price. It can either withhold supply or it can increase supply of oil and the price of oil will go up or down. It's a swing producer. That's an energy superpower. The United States is the world's largest LNG exporter. It can move prices depending on what its producers do with supply, whether increasing or decreasing supply. Canada can't do any of that. When we're never going to be able to do any of that. And part of it is because of the nature of the oil. The only thing we can produce in quantity is the oil sands. And the oil sands is like a manufacturing. It's not like wells and, like conventional oil. So once you get it going at a certain volume in a project, you don't ever want to change that. You don't want to go up and down. You don't want to take, the last thing you want to do is take oil out of production. So in that chart there, what you see is we're number 4 in the world in oil production at about 5 million barrels a day. And Saudi Arabia and Russia are around 9.1, 9.2. And the US is now at about 13.2, 13.3 million barrels a day. All we can do is be a bigger producer. That's it. And if we increased our production like Danielle Smith wants to do, double it out of Alberta, that would get us to 9 and we'd be the same as Saudi Arabia. But we wouldn't be in a superpower. We can't move markets. But what it does is it gets everybody excited, right? Bank of Montreal chairman or CEO writes effusive op-eds in the Globe and Mail going, oh my God, we can't miss this opportunity to be an energy superpower. He can't even define what it is because it means nothing. It's a totally meaningless phrase. And this is the way they control the energy narrative. Andy,
And there's one other point that I want to reinforce, which is, let's say you build a pipeline to the coast through Newfoundland, and for some reason, if you can get it out there, you're still dealing with the global price of oil. Whether it's being shipped from the Gulf of Mexico, I still call it Gulf of Mexico, or from Newfoundland, it's still the global price of oil. So these fundamentals of the economic situation are not going to change, whether you have a pipeline or not.
when we talk about oil, not all oil is created. So the only source of supply in Canada that can really be materially increased is the oil sand. You can't increase conventional in Alberta, it's tapped out. You can't increase Newfoundland and Labrador, it's tapped out. You basically, in Saskatchewan, it's steady. Heavy sour crude oil is the only one we can increase because we got like, I don't know, 170 billion barrels of it in the reserves. Lots of reserves, lots of oil. But look at this. This is from 2018 when total global consumption was only 85 million barrels. But the economist that put this together says that the heavy sour side of it is essentially the same. And look at that. The market for heavy sour is only 10 million barrels a day. 1/10 of the market. We already produce 3.3 million barrels of it. We are the biggest. We're the 800-pound gorilla in the room. So what are we going to do? Take more market share from other competitors like Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Brazil or Mexico or Venezuela? Well, probably not, because in North America, which has 5.5 million barrels a day of refining capacity specifically for our oil, we're the low-cost competitor. We have 60% of the market. Nobody can beat us. In the US Gulf Coast, the Midwest, and the Rockies, California, we can outcompete anybody. When you get over to Asia, TMX tolls are $11. It's $1 for dockage and insurance, and it's $5 or $6 on an Aframax. Right. $18 in transport fee. Anybody want to hazard a guess what it costs Saudi Arabia to ship a barrel to China or India? $2 on a VLCC. Once you get it to water, costs nothing. So we're gonna. Anybody want to argue that we're going to out-compete the Saudis when their transport costs are $2 and our costs are $18? Unlikely. And we're only fighting over a small chunk of the market. And we have competitors. And our competitors, some of them do it a lot better. Oh, no, I wouldn't say that. We were actually pretty good at it. Competitors have advantages over us. Ours is a little more acidic. We have high transportation costs. We have regulatory costs, so on. So it is not clear that if you built a pipeline to Prince Rupert at 1 million barrels a day, that you could compete in China. Just on the information I gave you here, and it's so much more complex than that. So on the economics alone, competitiveness is not obvious. It's not self-evident, and we should stop letting them get away with the argument. Because that's what we're doing. We're letting the narrative triumph economics. Yes, sir.
What about Japan and Europe? Like, if China's not buying from you, you have like an ally in Europe and Japan. I mean, Trudeau didn't sign that agreement, but I'm pretty sure like Carney would have it better, like, signed with Japan, or like, your this contract saying that over the next 15, 20 years, we buy from Canada, which is much more cleaner apparently. And then that makes economic sense in that case, right?
None of that makes sense. How much oil do you think Japan, how much oil do you think Korea imports? Heavy crude, heavy sour crude, apples to apples, 350,000 barrels a day. And the refiners only buy the bottom chunk of the barrel. The stuff they buy for cheap at a discount. You don't want to be in Korea. You don't want to be in that market. You want to be in Japan. And anybody who tells you that we produce the cleanest oil in the world is full of crap. And I'll tell you why. The average emissions intensity per barrel in the oil sands is 66 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. Some of it is as high as 120. The global average is 27. The global average. The Saudis, everybody else produces oil at much less emissions intensity. Do you want to know what the oil sands unfunded liability, environmental liabilities is? Minimum of $130 billion. They don't pay to clean up their assets. They don't put money in the bank. They don't have security. They don't have bonds. They don't have a bank account somewhere with money squirreled away to clean up their mess when they're done. Unfunded liabilities. And why do you think they have this great narrative machine? It's because they got a lot of stuff to hide. And nobody wants to talk about it. I've been writing about doing work on the liabilities for the last 3 or 4 years. I've never had anybody challenge me because they know. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to have a public debate about it. This is one of the great unsung, unanticipated crises that we could face in Canada. The conventional side of Alberta's liabilities is another $130 billion. 80,000 inactive wells, on and on and on. It's a disaster in the making. And we keep being told that we are the most environmentally friendly oil in the world, the cleanest oil in the world, and it's all a lie. It's just simply not true. The data says it's not true. Okay, next.
And I think it's important to clarify, I'm not sure if you define sour. Sour means it has a higher sulfur content.
Right.
Which means that it's going to require additional refining to remove that sulfur, which is why we have a higher cost, as well as the fact that we have to inject water and chemicals in to take the oil out of the tar sands. So we're always going to be higher costs, no matter what amount of money the government puts into it, just by the nature of the reserves.
Andy's going to hate this slide. Now, I know where Andy got his data from. This comes from an economist called Kevin Byrne, who now works for S&P Global. And I've been interviewing him for 12 years on the oil sands. And these are the latest cost projections that they provided. And they're very different than Rystad's and Woodmax and others that you'll see. And on the I need to tell you what the difference between a short cycle and a long cycle. So if you're a shale well, you spend your capital, you drill your well, and in 1.5 years, your well is depleted and you move on and you have to drill another one. It's not the way it works. Oil sands is like a manufacturing facility. You build plants, you build extraction equipment, you build infrastructure like roads and and power, you bring in power, you bring in boilers, all kinds. It's billions and billions and billions of dollars to set up an oil sands facility. And it all gets paid up front. So it's the CapEx is very high and the OpEx is very low. But once that initial capital gets paid off, they're actually a very low cost producer. So $20 on the low end per barrel production cost and $27 average. Those are the latest figures for Kevin, and I'll let you fight it out with Kevin whether you agree with it. But it's the long cycle. Okay, so right now, the oil sands is going to bring on stream another 500,000 barrels a day by the end by 2030. If you optimize TMX, all that oil would fill up TMX, right? If you build another pipeline so that you now don't have any existing production, you have to bring in new production, and you have to spend all that capital, that's a long cycle investment, $60 to $80. Saudi's cost is $3, $5. The reason they need to make a lot of money is because they spend money. You know, the money goes to support their government. But from an economics point of view, you have to fill up the pipeline in Prince Rupert with $60 to $80 oil, and you're done. That is not going to be good. And then you have transportation costs on top of that.
I won't get into the price estimates. It seems on the low side for me, but I think one thing that's important to point out is TMX already has spare capacity. So do we really need another pipeline when the one that we've just bought isn't being used at 100%?
They're actually, I read that today, they're actually interested in expanding capacity now. Even though it's not yet fully utilized, but they're already thinking ahead, I guess. Anticipating.
Here's a question for the room about TMX and expansion. Ask me. There's a shipping bottleneck that happens in the Burrard Inlet with the bridge and the tides. So the Aframax vessels cannot be loaded up more than, I think, 50 to 70%. So they can't be fully loaded. And because of the tide cycles, you can only put a certain amount of ships through per day. So it doesn't matter what you do to the line, that bottleneck is always going to exist unless we build it. I don't see happening or even suggesting. So, and that's not being mentioned at all in media. Like, I mean, you mentioned it probably before, but I find that a very odd thing that we're talking about expansion and like, you got a tiny hole to go through and that hole is not going to get any bigger.
Well, one of the reasons what they're doing, Scott, is right now the tolls are settled at $11 an hour. And they're trying to get the Canadian Energy Regulator to lower their tolls in part to compensate for the higher cost of using partially loaded Aframax tankers.
So the PBO, the Parliamentary Budgetary Office, they do an estimate of, you know, the costs and the benefits of TMX on an occasional basis. And you'll see their latest report is very succinct, but the previous one in 2022, they pointed out that if TMX was sold, it would probably lose upwards of $300 million. So we have a liability that's going to keep losing value. And so that's why the government had to buy this, because the private sector saw that it's not really a valuable investment.
Okay, so the question then becomes, you know, where is demand going for oil? Well, China has, over the last 20 years, been about the only source of demand growth for the industry. And it now consumes 17.4 million barrels a day. That's a 2024. So OPEC says that China's growth is going to continue to 2045. IEA says it's peaked already, or will peak next year at the latest. So I went and I looked, I said, what do the Chinese think about that? What do they think about their oil demand? So Sinopec and China National Corp. Sinopec's the big state-owned refiner, and China and National oil. They think peak year is 2027, and the 2050 level is 7.5 million barrels. In other words, they're going to lose 10 million barrels a day of demand. China is a CNPC, 6.25, so 11 million barrels of demand a day they're going to lose. And Peking University puts it even lower. So between We are now looking at sending a pipe, building a pipeline of 1 million barrels a day to send oil to a declining market. Where the customers, these are our customers telling us that they're going to use 10 to 12 million barrels a day less of oil. And we don't even acknowledge that. We don't even talk about it. Nobody at the National Post or the Globe and Mail ever bothers to do this kind of work. They're just stenographers. They go to a press conference, they interview a minister or whatever. And nobody does this kind of work. I want to ask Andy why academics aren't doing this. But
Some of us are.
look, okay, nobody's going to tell the Alberta economists that I said this, right? There are economists like Andrew Leach at the University of Alberta, Kent Fellows at the University of Calgary, Trevor Tome, Jennifer Winter, all of these people write about oil and research about oil all the time. You tell me why a journalist has to go digging into this stuff and find it for himself. Why is it up to one journalist in all of Canada to go find out this information and a whole bunch of others? So if Andy asked the rhetorical question, why don't we know this? Why isn't it in the media? Why aren't we having this conversation? It's because nobody cares enough to do the hard work. This is hard work. I spent days reading reports to learn this stuff. Anyway, next one. There are alternatives to burning bitumen, alternatives to sending it to China. So here's one thing you could do. And this is, first of all, optimize what you have. We already spent $34 billion to build one pipeline. Use it all. Did you know that there's a technique called, did you know that it's not bitumen that goes into those pipelines, it's dilbit. It's bitumen diluted with light hydrocarbons, up to 30%. Because bitumen by itself is like peanut butter. I'm going to flow in a pipeline. And the diluent has no value. So we're essentially got a pipeline with 30% of it that's not being used for anything economic. And there are technologies called partial upgrading that will upgrade bitumen to a heavy crude or a medium crude that will flow in a pipeline. So why wouldn't you say as a government or as a regulator, every barrel that goes into TMX has to be upgraded so we're not wasting any of that space that we paid $34 billion for? Why wouldn't you do that? Drew bit by rail. It's called Diluent Recovery Unit. It's in Gibson Energy. It's in Hardisty. They have 50,000 barrels a day of capacity, and they take the diluent. They ship it out from the oil sands to Hardisty, just near Edmonton. They take the diluent out just enough so that they can put it in a rail car, and they rail it to Princeton, or they rail it to Vancouver, or they rail it to US Gulf Coast. Yes, it's a little more expensive than per barrel. But somebody explain to me why the taxpayer of Canada has to spend $34 billion so that we can save oil producers that are majority owned by Americans and have foreign investors, and save them a few bucks on a barrel of oil. Why are we doing that? That's insane. Okay. And by the way, 200,000 or 300,000 barrels a day of our oil is re-exported from the US Gulf Coast. It goes to Europe, it goes to somewhere else, it goes to foreign markets. There's other alternatives. Or, and this is my favorite, we can begin, the Alberta Innovates Agency has been working for years on turning bitumen into materials. The future of bitumen from the oil sands is not fuels. The worst thing you can do is burn. The dumbest thing you can do. If you take a $50 barrel of oil of bitumen, a $50 barrel of bitumen, and you turn it into carbon fiber, now it's worth $200. Why would you sell it for 50 bucks? Why would you leave money on the table? You know why? Because oil companies don't innovate. They just do what they've always done. You dig it up, process it, send it off the market, let somebody else worry about it. Canadians own the resource. It's our bitumen. It's not their bitumen. Why aren't we demanding, no, you keep it in Alberta and you make carbon fiber and you make asphalt binder and you make graphite and you do all that other stuff and create jobs for Canadians and don't burn it. Do something better with it. So that's one thing, advanced materials. The second thing is crude to chemicals. Who here knew that Alberta has the second largest petrochemical complex in North America, outside of Texas and Louisiana? Around Edmonton and Joffre, it's huge. Chinese and now the Saudis are working on technology. China's actually got a couple of big complexes where instead of taking oil and refining it and then making petrochemicals out of it, you just go crude to chemicals. You bypass that step and it's much more efficient. You get 70 to 80% of the oil produces some sort of chemical, lubricants or whatever it happens to be. Why not do all that value add in Alberta? You already got a petrochemical complex or, cluster. Do something different with it. Why aren't we talking about that? Why does this never come up in the national media or national conversations? Because it's not the oil and gas company's narrative. That's why. They don't care about this stuff. Do what they always do. And
Just an interesting fact about the graphene and graphite. More graphene and graphite in batteries and lithium ion batteries than lithium. So we're all talking about shortage of the lithium. We could be using batteries for electric cars, which would be a flip of what the oil industry is talking about.
yeah. That's right. We got the process. That's the Alberta. The irony is, Alberta Innovates is an Alberta Crown Corporation. So the people of Alberta own the intellectual property to do all of this stuff. Why are they not doing it? Okay, so here's the conclusion. Where is the business case? I think I've done a pretty good job of making the argument that there is no business case. There just isn't a business case to build another pipeline. The oil industry is the bulls are in charge. And it's unreasonably optimistic demand scenario. It's an OPEC scenario. So that's the first problem. But here's the bigger problem. Our political and business class 100% bought into that narrative. 100%. I never thought I'd see Mark Carney championing oil. But here we are. So that's a problem. We now have our political and business class bought in. And we should say, as Canadians, no pipeline, no LNG expansion, and no oil sands expansion without business case. So here at Energy Media, whenever we get on, like I get on CBC and I do a lot of stuff east of BC. I live in BC and nobody knows who I am. You go to Alberta, everybody knows who I am. So I do a lot of radio and TV, and I always say, show me the math. If you can't show me the math, you shouldn't get a cent of taxpayers' dollars. Without taxpayers' dollars, none of this happens. So you guys are Canadians, ask if anybody comes up with it, show me the math. I can guarantee you they will not show you the math. Andy, I'm gonna sit over here if you don't mind. Sure. Because we're gonna go to Q&A, right?
Yeah, we are.
Can I maybe?
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to add a few pieces of context, I think, for a minute, talking about where the rest of the world is going these days. I think that's going to be useful for the conversation. So when you look at investment in energy, like the world now invests twice as much in clean energy than it invests in fossil fuels. And when you look at employment in the energy sector globally, since 2021, more people have been employed in clean energy than in fossil fuel energy. Those two factoids are from the IEA. And the other thing I think is really helpful to know is that the IEA modeling, I just looked again in the World Energy Outlook 2024, that's the most recent one. And the IEA, a very reputable organization that has studied for decades energy systems, and they now see a peak in fossil fuel demand for all fossil fuels by 2030. And that is not a scenario that is net zero or advanced pledges. No, that's actually in the current policy scenario by now. So that's really interesting. And this was before Trump came into power for the second time. So maybe this is going to shift back by a couple of years or something, but it's not going to fundamentally change the picture. And the last point I wanted to make is because the US is obviously an important trading partner for Canada, but if you look beyond the US, if you look at Canada's 10 largest non-US trading partners, all of them are focusing on building clean economies. All of them have net zero commitments, all of them have carbon pricing systems in place, and they also have EV requirements to reshape their transportation systems. And those are basically China, Mexico, the European Union, the UK, Japan, Korea. So those are no small economies. Just, I think that's useful for context.
Andy, can I make one point that I forgot?
Go for it.
Last year, China imported $325 billion worth of oil and $50 billion worth of LNG. One of the reasons why China and other Asian economies are electrifying as fast as they are is because they don't want to be dependent on expensive imports, fossil oil and gas imports. If you can, like, think about it from China's point of view. If you can expand your power sector with wind and solar and hydro and nuclear, and you can then build all of that stuff yourself domestically, and then you build all of the demand devices that use those fossil fuels, like electric vehicles and heat pumps and temperature batteries and all of that kind of stuff. And you expand that enough that you displace all of that oil and all of that LNG, all that money stays in your economy. $375 billion a year. They're enormously incented to not consume oil and gas and to electrify. But here's the kicker. Not all Asian countries, China, Malaysia, Thailand, what I meant, have explicit government policies to displace oil and gas consumption with electricity. They want to electrify their economies on both the supply side and the demand side. It's government policy. So why do we not know that? We want to ask that question.
So I'm not sure if I should mention this, but I will anyway. I have a paper that I'm reviewing for a workshop next week written by a UBC professor. And what they did was Canada has a lobby registry, and they record the amount of times that either a head of a minister or a prime minister or a ministry gets visited by a lobbyist. And I'm sure you can guess who the number one lobbyist is. It's the CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. I can't remember the exact numbers. It was like 35 times as much as the next lobbying group. And certainly for climate change, it's like there's no comparison between the amount of influence that an environmental NGO has compared with CAP. And so it's all coming really back down to politics and what we call regulatory capture, the ability of the industry to capture policy.
Yeah, just maybe a question for the room. Do you think it's, you mentioned it a couple of times where it's like they're not doing the numbers or the policymakers are not looking at the data or the markets? Or do you think it's more really the fact that Mark Carney and his administration kind of came in with the promise of let's bring back oil, economic recovery, more oil, come back, fossil fuel come back. Do you think it's just that the administration is using this narrative that you're talking about as well? And it's mostly the deep kind of influence that the fossil fuel has on the Canadian government rather than people maybe not being as careful with the numbers?
Can I be pedantic for just a minute?
Go ahead.
It's not an administration, it's a government.
Yeah.
Administration is the US system.
Oh, yeah, please.
Am I right, Andy?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Anyway, so the answer, here's an interesting, last Tuesday, Wednesday, I emailed the Department of Resources and Natural Resources Canada, Minister Hodgson's department, right? And I said, the minister is claiming these numbers for LNG. I said, please tell me where that information comes from. What's the evidence, the data backing up his claims? And they were very nice. They wrote me this 5 or 6 paragraph email, and they explained it all. Then they got to the numbers. And they said, we believe that 400 billion cubic meters of gas today, or LNG demand today, will be 630 billion cubic meters of demand by 2050. And I said, I wrote them back and I said, where'd you get that from? Oh, it came from the IEA's World Energy Outlook 2024. Here's the page, here's the link. So I go there and it's the STEPS scenario. There's no mention of the fact that the APS, I wish I had the chart here, because when you look at their LNG, the IEA's LNG demand, STEPS is here in 2030 and APS is just a little bit down here. And then you go to 2040 and STEPS is here and APS is way down here. And then you get to 2050, STEPS is up here and APS is way down here. So if I'm a minister, I'm looking at that chart, and I'm going, crap. There's in 2050, the APS is 1/3 of the STEPS modeling. Ding, ding, ding. That should be alarm bells, because what that means is massive error bar. Massive error bar. It could be this, could be that, it could be who. 2 days ago, Putin and Xi signed an agreement on the Power of Siberia 2. 60 billion cubic meters of LNG demand. Oops, just evaporated. That's the error bar. So if I'm the minister and I can't even read the one frickin' chart and come to that conclusion, I mean, come on. This is such basic stuff. This is like economics 101 stuff.
It's disingenuous at best, and it's really, in a way, intellectual fraud, because remember how we started? We started the conversation. We pointed out that the Canadian public is convinced that we need to invest in oil and gas. And what we pointed out is it's so obvious that nothing could be further from the truth. But how do we get that message out there? It's difficult when, as Markham pointed out, 90% of the information you're receiving is, hey, oil and gas is the only thing that will keep our economy going. Dr. Wright.
Can we go, is it easy for you to bring your slides up, Andy?
Our slides.
Yeah, slides. The last one where you talked about the cost of the energy transition. I think it was 180 or 120 billion, 128 billion, there you go. So I throw this out as a challenge. I am not an oil advocate, let me be very clear, but I'm going to play devil's advocate for a little bit here, just for the fun of debate. So that 128 billion number, I am going to take exception to. And we know this from our previous work, that if you look at the total energy consumption of British Columbia alone, 20% of this is electricity, 80% is fossil fuel. Heat your homes, move your gear, create your food, whatever. On a joule per joule basis, which is fundamental physics, if we want to transition our energy system to be all electricity, that tells you straight out the gate, you've got to develop an electricity system that delivers 4 more times than it currently does, total electricity. Our current capacity is about 20 gigawatts of capacity. Site C was a 1 kilowatt machine, and it cost 20 billion notional, pick a number, 20 billion. So I need 80 Site Cs to replace and build that out. So we get to 20 billion times 80. Doesn't add up to that number. So you talk about intellectual honesty or transparency. The transition movement, let's call it that, or the green movement, has to be bloody honest about the cost of what it takes to build out the electricity system. Now, we're not going to need 4 times because heat pumps and electric cars are way more efficient. So let's just give ourselves credit there, and maybe 2.5 times 3 if we're lucky. But I haven't even included the grid, which we need to upgrade, because the grid at this point is already at saturation. The transformers on my street burn out every year because we're all plugging our Teslas in when we get home, right? So that's a massive capex too. So the cost of transition is way more higher than people. So it's true.
Fair point, that's from the Institute
My
of
second-
Sustainable Finance.
So my second point, or I've got 3 points that I want to shift the overviews. We talk about steps, different energy transitions. The one thing that is also being forgot is energy equity in the world. Only 1/10 of the global population have access to the energy lives, rich energy lives that we have. 9/10 of the world do not live on the energy levels we live. They can't afford to buy out, lithium-ion battery technologies. When I was in Sumatra, in the heart of the most impoverished communities, they sell and buy gasoline in 1 liter bottles that they're Coke bottles repurposed, because that will get their little two-stroke motorbike, get their kids to school in the morning, go and get the food they need. That is, so those markets are not going away. And as much as the first world markets might diminish, nobody's accounting and thinking about energy poverty and energy security for the 9/10 of the population, which will buy up that oil at 10 cents on the dollar if it's available. And then just to sort of reframe some of this, I don't believe that the bean counters in these big companies make mistakes, right? They do make big profitable decisions, right? So TMX cost us 30 billion to build. But if you shove 1 million barrels a day down it, is that about correct? What it can do? What can it do?
EMX is 590,000 barrels.
So in 10 years, it will have paid for itself. You get $20 a barrel profit down the line, and you can take exception there.
That's not correct.
Why not? Do the math.
Go look at Trevor Tome's analysis in the hub.
Let's look at, forgive me, Malcolm. I'm just reframing for the big.
Fair enough.
How much profit per barrel comes? We dig it out of the ground in the tar sands between 20 and 30. You sell it globally at maybe 10 bucks below the global price because it's heavy crude, whatever. There's a big chunk of profit in there. How much does the pipeline guys get for shipping it to the coast here?
$11.
$11. So that's a $40 billion cash flow over a 10-year period. I did the math before we were talking, I'm scaling here. So my point being is the bean counters know they can break even in about 10 years. The market's going to go for 20 years, 30 years, they'll get, diminishing returns. It's not a loss project for them. And then throw the third world component into it. So my challenge to the room is perhaps how do we take these two massive opposed narratives and build a higher plane of discussion that eclipses this? Because the repugnant conclusion is Canada's in a bind economically. We know how to build pipelines. We have the companies that can dig it. And I've traveled the whole Enbridge pipeline. I've photographed it and fought against it in the days. They can roll out a pipeline with so much ease because we've got the skill sets. Energy workers for sure can do it. But what do you export when you have your own energy network? Right, that is the trouble. We're not exporting energy projects here that are green, create energy here and leave it here, right? So I think we have to have a much higher plane of discussion if we're going to get over their narrative versus our narrative or the green narrative. There's this gap in the discussion. So that's my challenge to the room to think about.
I'd like to be the first one to take a crack at it because you're pitching to my wheelhouse. This is the thing I do every day, all day. And there's a whole pile of stuff that I could respond to. Like, for instance, the Trans Mountain Corporation has to file financial projections with Canadian Energy Regulator. If you go in and look at their 3 scenarios, they're not nearly as rosy as you made them out to be. And there's a whole bunch of error bars because their assumptions are no producer will ever fail, no producer will ever renege. All assumptions which can be challenged. But that's the grist for another. We could get it. That's we're getting in the weeds. I think I laid out some of the strategy here. We, in fact, at Energy Media, we launched a little campaign called Canada 250. And we said, what Canada should do in response to Trump is 3 things. 1, add value to your natural resources. Stop shipping raw logs to China. Stop shipping raw oil and gas to the US, et cetera, et cetera. 2, electrify everything. Electrify everything. You got to build a grid. I agree with you. All the modelers say, no, the developed economies will be 2 to 3 times, undeveloped economies will be 3 to 5 times expansion of the grid. No question. But the Alberta Utilities Commission did a study 3 years ago where they estimated the cost of going to a net zero grid in Alberta by 2050, and the cost was between $44 billion and $52 billion, of which only $10 billion would be paid for by the public.
That's not assuming they're taking up the fossil fuel component, it's just making their grid clean and their current production clean, right? But that's why it often gets lost, right? So go ahead.
I gotta jump. So, Scott Jansen, I worked for BC Hydro for 17 years. I'm now an independent consultant doing microgrids throughout.
An engineer, by the way.
Engineer, electrical engineer. So there's a bunch of framing issues that we need to take care of in Canada, first of all. Energy is highest value is not when it's produced, it's when it's consumed.
Yeah.
Anytime we produce any sort of energy thing and we send it overseas, we are sending value to somebody else. So it makes no sense. We should, as a first rule, Canada should not export any energy. Zero. We should do the manufacturing in Canada. Then you would get all the highest value. So that's number one. But we don't think that way. We think we'd rather ship out a raw log than make a desk. That's kind of Canada's mindset. Second thing, BC grid upgrades. So BC has a surplus of energy. Don't let anybody tell you anything different. We have plenty of capacity. What we do not have is enough wires, and we don't have any way to store the energy when it is delivered. We do have massive reservoirs, Williston Reservoir, it's massive ones, but it is in a place where there is no load. The load is low, the reservoir is there. So what we need is what is called distributed energy resources, to put solar on rooftops, put batteries in your community underneath those transformers, so those transformers don't burn out, and peak shaves. All of those have been done in Australia, in Europe for decades. Canada is the last to show up to do this. I mean, this is something that we're working on. We need to do this, and we need to do it in a smart way, but we do not have innovative thinkers in our institutions in Canada, and I'm including BC Hydro and including our governments. We're not innovative. We are the last to the party, showing up last. So all of those innovations, and then to your point, I mean, the efficiency of a heat pump is 3 times as efficient as fossil fuel heater, right? So you're getting the coefficient of the COP is 300 instead of 100. So you're exactly right. 20% of the grid is, or 20% of the energy in BC is electric, and 80% is fossil fuel. But you would only have to double because of the losses that you have on combustion engine is about 30% efficient, and an EV is like 80 to 90, yeah, depending on the full cycle. So all of these things can be done just by doing efficiencies and electrifying everything. Third world, the other thing about third world, because I've heard this a lot, I have a buddy from Venezuela, he has the same argument. What we are going to be seeing in the third world is distributed energy resources leapfrogging like India did with cell phones.
Yeah.
India had basically the amount of actual wired phones that people had in India was like 1 per 1,000 people. Now there's more than 1 cell phone per every person in India. And they just leapfrog the whole thing. And
I'm central to that time, so I'm very aware of the leapfrog.
Yeah.
Except when the cost of entry was cheaper to build the cell phone network than a wired network. But the cost of entry to free fossil fuels isn't. And that's the difference here that people are forgetting, right? I have got 2-stroke motorbikes everywhere in Indonesia, and they buy their gas, right? And they will run those motorbikes into the ground before they're buying the lithium-ion plug-in motorbike to plug in the wall. And they're the poorest people in the world. So it's a different equation.
Yeah. No,
hang on a second. Look, China is the argument against that.
Yeah.
Because China has already electrified 43% of its 2 and 3.
China is the biggest economy in the world with 100 million middle class that are driving that.
Yeah, but that's a 1.4 billion fleet of 2 and 3 wheelers. So we're talking about out in the rural areas where they're just as poor as in Indonesia, but they come up with innovations, like they come up with battery swap. So you don't charge it, you go in and you have a little tower and you put your battery back in, and you pick a battery, you slap it on your little scooter, and away you go. And they've electrified already 43% of that fleet.
We're almost out of time. I want to open it up to anyone who hasn't spoken, who has a question or a comment that they want to share at this time. Okay, Stefan.
If nobody else, like. Scott, just your name, right? I really liked what you said. A lot of the points I wanted to make as well about distributed energy resources that can be pooled by utility to create a virtual power plant. So that's one way to get at. It's absolutely right, Andrew, that BC, Canada needs to increase investments in the grid. And one way to do it is through these DERs. The other thing that you also said was that fossil fuels are incredibly wasteful. Totally right. There's like this really neat report by RMI, the Rocky Mountain Institute, that says that almost 2/3 of all primary energy is wasted in energy production with fossil fuels. So that's a huge problem. So you don't indeed need to replace all the 80%. And the other point was actually, it's also really important to remember that advances in clean technology, electricity generation, cost declines over the last 10 years have been incredible. Like look at the cost of solar PV, for example, over the between 2010 and 24 has been 90% down. And then you add battery storage, they also have an incredible cost decline. 93% between 2010 and 2024 battery storage cost decline. So this is what we need to leverage. Relatively inexpensive clean electricity and decentralized electricity generation and use, microgrids, smart grids. This is the kind of exciting future.
Can I tell an anecdote that supports what you're saying? So I interviewed this young engineer. He grew up in Costa Rica, went to Detroit, got himself his degree, got a little experience, went back to Costa Rica. And he said, we have a really bad grid in Costa Rica, he said. So I went to various like manufacturers, like his example was an ice cream factory. You can't have the grid go down on an ice cream factory, right? He said, so what I do is I go in, I take really cheap Chinese solar panels, really cheap Chinese batteries, really cheap Chinese digital controls. What I bring is integration. And I build a system for that ice cream factory. I integrate all of these pieces so that it works for them and they have cheaper energy and it never goes down. So they don't have the costs of restarting and cleaning out and doing all of that kind of stuff. And so one night, he told me this about 6 months ago in an interview. And now when I get experts on, I always ask them the question, I tell them that story and they go, yes, that's a big issue now. It's not the cost of the technology, it's the cost of making it work. And that's where some of these third world countries, they lack that tech, they lack the expertise, they lack the experience, but it's coming. And China is driving a lot of that. So anyway, that's the anecdote.
Yeah, go ahead.
Slightly different from what you're saying, but when you reference, can't remember who said it, but referencing countries that were ahead of the ball compared to Canada in terms of innovating and global. My first thought was they don't face the same federalism challenges Canada does. As you mentioned, Carney kind of doing a bait and switch on clean energy, and my first thought was, well, the Liberals were completely down in the polls. They need to get Alberta to get it across the finish line. So how do you combat that? It's a unique thing that Canada faces that European countries don't.
Good point.
I think the most important thing is you can't go through an incumbent industry transition only with sticks. You have to give carrots. You have to give the workers and the industry in Alberta, as Markham was suggesting, a way to transition to other forms of employment. And so far, nobody has presented that vision yet. If you're just going to say, we're just going to ding you and put a price of carbon and we're going to phase you out, you'll never succeed politically. You have to say, we're going to transition you to another industry.
Here's another point. Charlie Angus, everybody knows who Charlie Angus is, right? He said, I interviewed him once and he said, Canada is three oligarchs in a trench coat. And the context for the conversation was incumbents rule. We're a small, open economy, and we have a few big companies. We have oil companies, we have utilities, we have mining companies, we have forestry companies. We don't have very many of them. And they dominate. And I interviewed a guy named Val Jensen about 5 years ago. And he was a former utility executive out of Illinois. And something he said stuck with me. He said, when your things are changing, for God's sake, don't ever let the incumbents lead the process. Because they don't want change. They want to impede change because they like the profitable business model that they've had for decades and they want to keep it that way. So where we are, this is one of my problems with the major projects office and Carney's approach. It only works with incumbents. It only works with those companies that have shovel-ready projects and have the capital and. Yes.
I'm so sorry. I know we don't have a lot of time, but then how? Because I like China, what it has is an economy that has a market, but it plans for that market. It plans for the future of the market and the industries and the economy. We don't have that. And it feels like an issue that is becoming more and more systemic and entrenched. So what do we do?
I'm gonna reintroduce an idea that was popular when I was your age and has since gone out of unpopular. Public ownership. Peter Lougheed in 1970s Alberta. How many crown corporations did he create? Alberta Energy Corporation. He did a bunch of stuff in the oil sands with the Astra. I mean, on and on and on. All of the oil sands is here because of Peter Lougheed. The petrochemical plants are there because of Peter Lougheed, and he used public ownership. And some of them were joint ventures. And we've let Milton Friedman. I'm old enough to remember when Milton Friedman and Ronnie Reagan got elected in 1980, and that was the end of that. Suddenly now government is bad and government shouldn't pick winners and government shouldn't do this and government. Baloney. It's our public, it's our interest. And what has China done? How many of those EV companies started out as state-owned companies?
Mostly.
How many Sinopec, on and on. Saudi Arabia, SABIC and Saudi Aramco. All of the countries that are making the pivot, many of them are using public ownership. And that's one tool.
And we're almost out of time. Alsu?
Yeah, I have a quick question in connection to Chinese demand as well. We've discussed China quite a bit. I happen to focus mostly in my research on China and Russia, so I appreciate you mentioning Pauer of Siberia. I wanted to understand if this demand, the way you see it, is unspecified, because the quality of oil that Russia produces, the quality of oil that Canada produces is not the same. Based on what I've read about Pauer of Siberia, even the first pipeline is being underutilized precisely because of the quality of the gas that is being delivered is not up to Chinese standard, and they try to diversify their purchases. So there are arguments that are being made that Pauer of Siberia too is more a political project than it is an economic. So I wonder if your demand, the way you look at it, you recognize that the way China structures its demand is not the same for different types of oil. Does that account for it? Does any of these people or organizations that produce these statistics account for this kind of difference in demand?
Absolutely, because if you look at the grades that are consumed in refineries and those big petrochemical complexes like Hingley and so on, our oil is too acidic. They were designed for Saudi and Basra heavy. So they have about a 2% acid content. Ours is 3.5. So then you have to change the metallurgy for the refining. This gets really complex. And I gave you the high level view as a journalist. Really, to have a good conversation, we would have to get some experts in here who know this kind of stuff. We don't ever do that. We have lots of questions, but we don't ever have the people in the room who give us the answers. Because I'm sure that everything I said was, maybe there are some answers to them, or I'd like to hear them, before we commit our tax dollars to it.
Dr. Wright, you have the last word.
Just to follow on previous paragraph, I think when you have the luxury of a 30-year planned economic wrong way, then you can say, hey, we're gonna double down, like China did 250 gigawatts of installed clean energy last year. Eclipsed the world. But when you have a free market economy and you can say, my stock shareholders want a return in 3 years, you're gonna back a pipeline because, we can argue the numbers, but the reality is in 10 years, I can make double your money. Sign up now, double your money. You're gonna love it. Right?
Short term.
And the short term, greedy people take double your money on a decade, right? So it's really as base as that, because I don't care, because after 10 years, I still own the pipeline. And if I'm getting 90 cents on the dollar for the next 2 years and 80 cents on the dollar after that, at the 20-year mark, I tripled my money, right? Whatever the numbers are. And the bean counters in North America look at it like that. And a large and disaffected nation of workers in the coal industry in particular, to sway Trump's thinking to go, push everything back. It becomes, as I said to Andy, I'll just round it out with a compliment to Andy. How about we close there? I'm an engineer. I'm frustrated beyond belief that we can't make changes because I'm an evidence-based guy. I run the numbers, I come to my conclusion. It's clearly obvious. It's the big liberal failing. The elephant in the room is we talk to values, not numbers. And the Republican and right-leaning movement is very good at twisting your thinking so that they fall. Which is why Andy in political science is one of the most important professors we have, because he's arguing and hoping to make us think critically at the sociological level, not escape the narrative, right? Well, the point, right?
Well, as Markham pointed out, we build these hydro stations, we built the Trans-Canada Highway. We should look at clean energy as an infrastructure, a public investment. And so that's where policy leadership will come in. And as Stefan pointed out, if we make those investments, we'll create the jobs along with it.
You know Dave Gray, right? The economist, the economist in Alberta? No? He helped design the deregulated system 30 years ago. He says, if we're gonna build these interties between and make them national power grid, he said, how are you gonna create electricity between them? How's that gonna work? Crown Corporation. That's how you can make it work. But think outside the box. Instead of inside the box. So, Mr. Engineer, you know lots of oil and gas engineers.
Not overly, no, I'm an electrical engineer.
I know hundreds of them. And one thing I can tell you is, inside the box, they're the most brilliant people you'll ever meet. They will innovate inside the box till the cows come home. They'll fix the problem. Ask them to innovate outside the box? No, they don't do that because there's too much risk. And we need outside the box innovation.
So the point is that if we continue to let this regulatory capture happen, people will make money for 2 or 3 years. But what we're pointing out is in 10 years, the rug will be completely under that. And we have no plan for a transition at that. And so then Alberta will be in really bad shape.
And that's the sad thing, because Alberta is triple blessed because they have the sunlight and they have the wind.
And geothermal. Okay, on that somewhat optimistic note, I want to thank my fellow panelists and especially the audience for being so patient. Thanks so much for coming out. And let's hope we